In this tutorial, we're looking at the continue statement in JavaScript. What the continue statement does is when certain conditions are met, we will restart the loop in a new iteration. So that's what we do with loops after all, is we iterate through something, and when certain conditions are met, we will use our continue statement, and that will cause the loop to immediately restart in a new iteration. So let's look at an example of that. We are starting off with an array of 12 values, and we're setting I to 0. Now the first kind of loop that we're going to use continue with is a while loop. So let's check it out. While a sub I is less than a dot length, so while this condition returns true, we're going to go in here. And the first thing we're doing is we're entering an if conditional. So if a sub I modulo 2 is equal to 0, increment I by 1, and then continue. So when it gets this continue, it's going to go back up to the while loop. I is going to be incremented by 1, and the first time it's going to check a sub 0, then a sub 1, and so on. So if whatever value is returned here, and then divided by 2 does not leave a remainder, increment I, and then restart the loop. If this isn't true, then we're going to continue on in the while loop, and we are going to output a sub I, and then increment I by 1. And let's take a look at that. So you can see that with this code, we only printed out the odd numbers, because whenever we got to an even number, we continued and we incremented I and we restarted. Let's look at another example. Here we're resetting I to 0. We're creating a variable n is set to null. We're creating a variable r which is set to a new array. It has 2 elements in it. We're creating an object. Inside the object there's 3 properties. This is their name, the property's name, and the property's value, and so on. And here we have our A array, and you can see that the A array contains all kinds of stuff. I have a string in here, we have the R array, we have an object, and we have a null value. Okay, so let's look at the loop we're going to use with this. For I is set to 0, as long as I is less than the array's length, increment I by 1, and output this. Let's take a look. Okay, so you can see we've got a total mess here. We've got an array of all the different kinds of stuff in it. So let's look at our next for loop. And what I'm doing here is basically very similar to this one, but instead of outputting the value of the element in the array, I'm outputting its type. And let's look at that. And you can see we have numbers here, objects, and strings. Okay. So the reason why I did this is because what I want to do now is I want to only output the numbers, not objects, not strings. So let's try to do that. I'm resetting I to 0, and then we're entering a for loop again. For I is set to 0, I is less than an array length, increment I, and let's see what we have here. So if the type of whatever element we are in the array, wherever we are, if the type of it is not equal to number, then continue. Okay, don't do this. Continue, which means go back up to the start of the loop. Now, when we use the continue statement in a for loop, this will happen. So it will increment I each time, or else we would end up in an infinite loop. And let's see what happens when it gets to a number. So if the type of A, let's suppose this is a number. So if it equals a number, then we are, so if this evaluates to false, then we're not going to do this, and we're going to output the number. And let's take a look at that. Okay, and you can see we've only output the numbers. And And let's look at our last example. Okay, so what I want to do here is let's look back at this array for a second. So we saw that in this array we had a few different objects, okay? But the object that I'm looking for is this one, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to search through the array and we're looking for, so let's look at this first one. If the type of something is not an object, so this is all the numbers and the strings, if it encounters a number of a string, we're going to continue and we're going to go back to the top. Also, if what we find is an instance of array, which we have one of, we have this stuff1, stuff2 is an array. If you find this guy, then also continue and go back to the top. And what that's going to do is it's just going to leave us with this object here. Okay, when it finds the object, we're going down here for all the properties inside the object element, output the properties. And we can see that in action here. Okay, so what it did was it found the only one that got to here was the object, which was this object. And then when it got to it, we used the for in loop to loop through all of its properties and then output them. Thanks for listening.